Sometimes the only way to understand power is to be sold to it. Iris had spent 23 years being invisible in her own family's house. Not the quiet kind of invisible that people romanticize, the kind that happens when a stepfather signs your name on a debt ledger without telling you, and your mother watches from across the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, saying nothing. She found out on a Thursday. She remembered that specifically because Thursday was the day she reconciled the bakery accounts, and she'd been good at it, better than anyone gave her credit for, sitting in the back office of her stepfather Clifton's catering business, cross-referencing invoices against supplier receipts while he glad-handed clients out front. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers were the only language that had never once let her down. The number that ruined her life was $480,000. She found it tucked inside a wire transfer confirmation that had been misfiled. Her own fault, technically, since she was the one who filed everything, between a linen supplier invoice and a liquor license renewal. The transfer was dated 6 weeks prior. The recipient account belonged to something called Vantage Capital Consolidated. The memo line read, "Collateral, I, Calloway, full settlement." Iris sat with that paper for a long time, long enough that the light in the office shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening. Long enough that her stepfather knocked twice on the door and told her she could go home. She went home. She sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment she rented, $212 a month below market because Clifton owned the building and she'd thought it was generosity, and she stared at the photocopy she'd made before refiling the original, collateral, her name. Her mother called at 9:30 to ask if she was coming for Sunday dinner. Iris said she'd try. She didn't ask about the transfer. Not yet. She needed to know first exactly what had been done, and to whom, before she walked into any room and said a single word out loud. That was the thing about being good with numbers. You learned to count everything before you made a move. Vantage Capital Consolidated had no public website. It had no Better Business Bureau listing, no LinkedIn page, no registered address in the Ontario Business Registry that she could find in an evening of searching. What it had was a phone number on a secondary document she found 3 days later, buried in Clifton's personal email, which she accessed from the shared business account he'd been too careless to separate, properly, and a name. Soren. Just the one name, in Clifton's email, typed in that obsequious way her stepfather had when he was scared. "Mr. Soren has confirmed receipt. Mr. Soren's office will be in touch. She should have gone to the police." She knew that, even then. She sat with her hand for 40 minutes one night with the non-emergency line pulled up, and she thought about what she would say. "My stepfather may have used my name as collateral on a debt. I'm not sure what that means legally. I'm not sure it's illegal at all." She thought about the officer's face. She thought about the fact that she had no money for a lawyer, that the apartment she lived in was owned by the man she'd be accusing, that her mother would call it a misunderstanding and cry. She put her phone down. What she did instead was pull every document she could find. She spent 4 days building a spreadsheet that mapped Clifton's actual financial position, the real one, not the one he showed investors, cross-referencing his supplier accounts, his loan history, the commercial mortgage on the catering kitchen, the 3 credit lines she now knew he'd maxed over the past 18 months. She built a picture. It was not a good picture. Clifton was underwater, had been for a long time, and somewhere in the gap between what he owed and what he had, he'd found her name and used it to buy himself more time. She emailed the spreadsheet to her own personal account. She printed 2 copies and put them in a folder. She made a 3rd copy and put it in a safety deposit box at a TD Bank branch she'd never used before, in a neighborhood that had nothing to do with her life. Then she waited. The knock came on a Wednesday, not a police knock. She knew what that sounded like from the upstairs tenant last spring. This was 3 measured strikes, evenly spaced, like someone counting them out deliberately. She looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark coats and, behind them, a black SUV idling at the curb in the February dark. She opened the door. The man in front was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. It was hard to tell. The way it was hard to tell with men who'd had difficult lives. There was a scar along his left jaw, faded to silver, and his eyes were the particular shade of grey that didn't shift with the light. He was looking at her the way an accountant looks at a set of books they've just picked up for the first time. Assessing, not impressed, not unimpressed, just measuring. "Iris Calloway," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Declan Soren." He said it without offering his hand. "You have something that belongs to me." She thought about the folder on her kitchen table. She thought about the safety deposit box. She said very carefully, "I think you have that backwards." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like someone had played an unexpected card and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "May I come in?" he said. Also not a question. "No," she said, "but I'll come out." She sat across from him in the back of the SUV, while the city moved past the tinted windows and the driver kept his eyes forward. Declan Soren sat with his hands loose on his knees and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, with the expectation that it would eventually tell him what he needed to know. "Your stepfather borrowed $480,000, he said, "against your name and signature." "Against a forged signature," she said. "My signature." "Which he forged." A pause. "You verified that." "I have copies of 3 documents in his handwriting that contain what's meant to be my signature. I have my actual signature on file at 2 financial institutions and a notarized affidavit from 6 years ago that I can pull for comparison. If you'd like to pursue him for fraud, I'll help you." She kept her voice even. "But the debt is not mine." Declan Soren studied her for a long moment. There was something almost clinical about it, and not in a cold way, in the way of someone who had learned to be accurate because inaccuracy had cost them somewhere badly. "What do you do?" he said. "For work, bookkeeping. Accounts payable and receivable, payroll, reconciliations. I've been doing Clifton's books for 4 years." She paused. "Which is how I found the transfer in the first place. And your stepfather has no idea you know." "No." He was quiet for another few seconds. Then, "The money is gone, Miss Calloway. Your stepfather spent it. Clifton is not the kind of man who can repay $480,000, and pursuing him through fraud proceedings would take 3 to 5 years and likely recover nothing." "I know," she said. "So the question becomes what to do about the debt. The debt that isn't mine. The debt," he said with a kind of patient precision that told her he'd had this conversation before and he knew how it ended, "that exists. Regardless of whose name it's in." She looked out the window. A streetcar was running parallel to them. She could see the bright interior, a woman reading on her phone, a kid with his backpack between his feet. Normal Wednesday. Normal city. "What are you proposing?" she said. "I have 2 people who currently manage my financial records. One is retiring. The other is," a brief pause that she suspected covered something she wasn't meant to ask about, "unavailable. I need someone who understands money at the level you appear to." The position would be salaried. The salary would be significant. He looked at her. "You would work off the debt. In approximately 14 months, at a rate we'd agree to in writing, you would be clear." She thought about the word clear. She thought about the apartment and Clifton's building and her mother on Sunday with her tea. "And if I say no, then I pursue your stepfather." A pause. "And you know better than I do what that will look like." She did know. She had built the spreadsheet. Clifton would lose everything, and her mother would be standing in the wreckage, and somehow, the way it always somehow worked, Iris would be the one who ended up holding the bucket. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved across his face that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of respect. "Go on. I see the full books. Not a curated view. Everything. If I'm doing this work, I'm doing it properly or not at all. Agreed. I live independently. My own place, my own address, not something you provide or have access to." A slight hesitation. "Agreed, and when the 14 months are done, I'm done. Clean break, no extensions, no renegotiations." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I should tell you what I do before you agree to anything. I have a general idea. Do you?" "You're not a legitimate capital firm," she said. "The structure of the transfer, the way the accounts are layered. It's not illegal looking, but it's not clean either. You're moving money through a lot of hands. I don't know the source yet, but I know what the architecture looks like." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you I'm not naive about what I'm walking into." The SUV had stopped without her noticing. She looked out the window and realized they were back in front of her building. Declan Soren held out his hand. "Monday," he said. 8 a.m. She shook it. His hand was warm and his grip was measured. Firm, but not performative. The hand of someone who didn't need to prove anything. She got out of the car and went inside and sat on the edge of her bed again and thought, "What have I just done?" Then she thought, the same thing I always do. Counted everything first. His offices were downtown, on the 14th floor of a building that looked from the outside like any other Toronto financial services firm. Frosted glass. A discreet logo, a receptionist who greeted Iris by name on Monday morning as though she'd been expecting her for weeks. Maybe she had. The work was not what she'd imagined, and it was exactly what she'd imagined. The numbers were real numbers. Salaries, vendor payments, operational costs, but the sources were layered through enough shell structures that tracing them felt like following a river upstream through a dozen tributaries, never quite reaching the headwaters. She was good at it. Better than she'd known she was, because no one had ever given her something this complicated before. Declan Soren was rarely in the office, and when he was, he moved through it with an economy of attention that she came to understand was deliberate. He noticed everything and showed almost nothing. Twice in that first week she looked up from a spreadsheet to find him standing in the doorway of her office, watching her work. He didn't say anything either time. The second time, she said, without looking up, "The Harrington account has a discrepancy. 42,000 spread across 6 line items over 4 months. Whoever set it up was careful, but not careful enough." A pause, then, "Show me." She showed him. He stood behind her and looked at the screen and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, "How long did it take you to find that?" 4 days. She paused. "I wasn't looking for it. It just appeared." Another silence. Then he said very quietly, "Good," and left. That was the longest conversation they had in the first 2 weeks. She met the others gradually. There were more people in Declan Soren's operation than she'd initially understood. Not a small family enterprise, but something layered and structured, with lieutenants who moved between legal and less legal concerns with a fluency that took her a while to stop finding unnerving. A man named Colm who handled logistics and spoke to her with the careful formality of someone who'd been told to be careful. A woman, Petra. She paused. Not Petra. That name was on the list. She'd read the file twice to be sure. A woman named Vesna who managed the building's security arrangements and who, in the 3rd week, appeared at Iris's office door at 7 in the evening with 2 coffees and the specific expression of someone conducting an unofficial interview. "You're still here," Vesna said. "Quarterly close," Iris said. "Most people are gone by 5. Most people aren't closing a quarter." Vesna set one of the coffees on the desk and leaned against the doorframe. She was compact, mid-40s, with the kind of stillness that suggested she'd trained herself into it. "He doesn't hire outside people," she said. "I noticed. The last 2 people who held this job." She stopped. "Never mind." "That's not reassuring." A faint, genuine smile. "No, I suppose it isn't." She looked at Iris for a moment. "You found the Harrington thing in 4 days." Yes, he had his previous accountant for 11 months. She never found it. Iris considered this. Did she know it was there? A long pause. "That's the right question," Vesna said, and picked up her coffee and left. The Harrington discrepancy turned out to be the beginning of something larger. The 42,000 was not an error or an external theft. It was an internal skimming operation, careful and slow, run by someone who had trusted access and had been patient about it. Iris traced it further over the next 3 weeks, following the logic of the numbers the way she'd follow a row of figures that didn't add up, adding a column each time one became clear, until she had something she could put on paper. She knocked on Declan Soren's office door on a Tuesday afternoon and laid the report on his desk. 13 pages. She'd been methodical. He read it without speaking. She stood. He didn't tell her to sit, and she didn't sit. That felt important somehow, to remain standing, to not arrange herself into deference. When he finished, he set the report down and looked at her. "You understand what this means," he said. "Someone inside your operation has been stealing from you for a minimum of 16 months. "Yes." A pause. "And you built this in 3 weeks, after the initial 4 days." He was quiet. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing its mid-afternoon thing. Distant traffic, a plane somewhere above the cloud cover, and Iris was aware, suddenly and clearly, that she was standing in the office of a man whose operation she'd just proven had a significant internal breach, and that the question of what he would do with that information was not something she could predict. "Thank you," he said. It was so ordinary a thing to say that it knocked her off balance. She had not expected thank you. She had expected something more guarded, more measured. Instead, he said it like he meant it, looking at her directly, and she found she had no ready response. "You're welcome," she said, finally. "I'll need access to the secondary ledgers to verify the full scope. You'll have it tomorrow morning." She nodded and turned to leave. "Miss Calloway." She stopped. "The 14 months," he said. "We may need to revisit the scope of the arrangement." She turned back. He was looking at her with that measuring expression, but there was something different in it now. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the careful neutrality he'd maintained since the SUV. "The rate stays the same," she said. "You agreed to that in writing." Something moved across his face. "Yes," he said. "I did. Then the scope doesn't need revisiting," she said. "It just needs doing." She left. It was not a clean 14 months. Nothing that real ever is. At the 4-month mark, she found a second discrepancy, this one external. A supplier billing the operation twice for the same shipments, carefully staggered to avoid pattern detection. She found it and fixed it, and didn't mention it to Soren directly. Just left the corrected reconciliation on his desk with a note. "Vendor billing error. Corrected. I've flagged the account for monthly auditing going forward." He left a note back on her desk the next morning, which he must have placed himself because there was no one else in the building at whatever hour he'd come through. The note said, "Noted. Thank you." And underneath, in the same precise handwriting, "The apartment on Beverly Street is available if you still need better space. No conditions attached. Your call." She looked at that note for a long time. She called Vesna. "The Beverly Street place," she said. "Is it actually no conditions, or is this a thing I'm supposed to read into?" Vesna was quiet for a moment. "With Soren," she said, "no conditions means no conditions. He doesn't do layered offers. He says what he means. That's an unusual quality in his line of work." "Yes," Vesna said. "It is." She took the apartment. At the 8-month mark, someone tried to pressure her. Not physically, it was more precise than that. A man she didn't recognize began appearing in her life in the way that made it clear the appearances were not accidental. At her coffee shop, at the pharmacy, once sitting 2 rows behind her on the eastbound subway. He never approached her, never spoke. Just appeared, counted her, the way she counted things. She documented each sighting with time, location, and a brief description. At the 11th sighting, she emailed the document to Declan Soren. He called her 40 minutes later. She'd never heard his phone voice before. It was the same as his in-person voice, level and unhurried, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there in the office. "How long?" he said. 11 sightings over 3 weeks. A pause that felt less like thinking and more like controlled response. "You should have told me at the first. I needed to establish it was a pattern first," she said. "I don't report things I can't verify." Another pause. "Are you at home?" "Yes. Stay there tonight." "I had planned to," she said. "I'm in the middle of the march, close." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Of course you are." And then, quieter, "Iris." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it the way she noticed discrepancies. Not dramatically, just noted. "I'll handle this," he said. "You have my word." She believed him. She sat with that belief afterward, the simple, almost startling fact of it, and tried to work out where it had come from. Not from fear, not from debt or obligation. From 14 months of watching a man say what he meant and mean what he said, and from 8 months of books that told her, in the language she trusted most, exactly who he was. The man stopped appearing after that. She didn't ask what had happened, and he didn't tell her. At the 12-month mark, Clifton called her. He'd found out, she wasn't sure how, and when she traced it back later, she realized it had been her mother, not maliciously, just in the way her mother had always moved through the world, rearranging things she didn't understand and calling it helpfulness. Clifton wanted to talk. Clifton wanted to explain. Clifton used the word mistake 4 times in the first 2 minutes of the call, and each time she watched it bounce off the wall of everything she'd built over the past year and fall to the floor. "I want you to know," she said when there was a pause, "that I have the document, the one with my forged signature. I have 3 copies, and I have a notarized comparison affidavit, and I have the spreadsheet of your full financial position as of 14 months ago. I'm not going to use them unless you give me a reason to." Silence. "I also want you to know," she said, "that I'm done. With the bookkeeping, with the apartment, with Sunday dinners. I'm done." She hung up. She sat very still for a few minutes in the apartment on Beverly Street, with the March light coming through the windows and the sound of the street below, a streetcar, a dog, someone's music briefly audible, and then gone. Then she went back to the march. Close, the 14th month ended on a Friday. She brought the final reconciliation to Declan Soren's office in the afternoon, the full accounting, every transaction, every corrected error, every flagged account, the 2 recovered discrepancies, the secondary audit protocols she'd built from scratch. She laid it on his desk the way she'd laid the first Harrington report, cleanly, without ceremony. He looked up from the document to her face. "This is complete," he said. "Yes." The second discrepancy recovery alone was. "It doesn't change the agreement," she said. "The debt is clear. We're done." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know the agreement." "Good. I'd like to offer you a position," he said. "A real one. Salaried at the rate we'd discussed, plus benefit structure, full access to the complete accounts, no debt component, no obligation." She looked at him. In 14 months, she had learned to read Declan Soren the way she read a set of books that had been put together by someone careful but not careful enough, by the things that were almost hidden, the slight inconsistencies that revealed the real shape of something. He was not a man who made unnecessary offers. He was not a man who said things to smooth over silence or manage her feelings. He was asking because he wanted her to stay. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his expression. She recognized it now. She'd seen it that first night in the SUV when she'd handed him her terms. It was the closest thing he had to a smile. "Go on," he said. "I set my own hours during close periods," agreed. "I report to you directly, not through Colm's structure, already intended, and if I find something I don't like, something that crosses a line I decide is a line, I walk, no negotiations." He looked at her for a long moment. The office was quiet. The city beyond the window was doing its end-of-afternoon thing, the light going amber and long over the skyline. "Those are fair terms," he said. "They're not negotiable terms," she said. "They're mine." He nodded, once. "Then we have an agreement." She did not shake his hand this time. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the one she'd never sat in before, in 14 months, because she'd always stood, and said, "Show me the Q1 projections. I want to see where we're starting from." He turned his laptop to face her. Outside, a streetcar ran its route through the late afternoon, and the city went on being itself. And Iris Calloway, who had once been invisible, who had once been a name on a debt ledger, who had never once in her life stopped counting before she moved, looked at the numbers on the screen and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had put her there, because she had chosen it.